The topic, as you know, is the Bush administration and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Is there any hope for peace, or is there a real hope for peace? We've been living with this problem for over 50 years. And some people may be sanguine that in spite of what appear to be its awful ramifications, we have endured it. But many people feel, of course, that this time is more severe. There are implications which reach the great powers in ways that they haven't been reached before. And so there is a level of pressure which perhaps has not existed before. But however puzzled we may be by this circumstance, Bob Freedman is really genuinely one of the nation's foremost authorities on this matter. And most of you know Bob very well. He can paint a picture of a complex context extraordinarily well, complete with the details and the actions of the major players. I know we all look forward to his formulation and portrayal this evening. Professor Freedman's Bachelor of Arts degree, University of Pennsylvania in Diplomatic History, Master's and PhD degrees from Columbia in International Politics. He's written 4 books on Soviet foreign policy. He's in the Middle East. And he's now completing a work on Russia's foreign policy in the Middle East since the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's edited 14 books on the question of Israel and the Middle East. He has been a consultant to the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency. He's been a commentator on BBC, National Public Radio, and other places. He's been a member of government delegations and private delegations, all engaged in the general purposes of peaceful conflict resolution and the attempts to shed light on this complex set of problems. He's currently begun work on the topic of tonight's presentation, that is the foreign policy of the second Bush administration toward the Arab-Israeli conflict. Bob is a good friend of the Council. He's been a help to the Council and a supporter since before its founding. He's a member of our Board of Trustees. He's spoken here before, and it's a genuine pleasure to present Professor Robert O. Freedman.
Thank you very, very kindly, Frank, for your lovely, warm introduction. I hope everybody can hear me without too much trouble. If I squint a bit, it's only because the light is in my eyes, so please bear with me if you're looking at me. I want to personally welcome the students who've come to tonight's lecture, along with their distinguished teacher. I hope that soon you will be full members of our council also. So remember that as you grow up, please join our council. Now, the topic tonight is the Bush administration and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Is there any hope for peace? Now, let me start off the discussion by noting that the Bush administration has been rather severely criticized for not playing a more active role in trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, for truth and advertising purposes, I must tell you I am a liberal Democrat who does not agree with a lot of what Mr. Bush is doing domestically. However, I think that in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict, he's gotten a very bum rap for not playing a more active role, because I'll try to indicate tonight that on 4 different occasions, the Bush administration indeed tried hard to bring about a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, most recently with the roadmap, and in each case it was sabotaged by Palestinian terrorism. And now Mr. Bush has a few other things on his agenda, including Iran's rapid acquisition of a nuclear capability, North Korea that we'll hear about at the Council in a few weeks, to say nothing about a problematic economy and a challenge from Wesley Clark, among others. So when there's now a pullback or a lull, as Condoleezza Rice said, in U.S. direct attention to the Arab-Israeli conflict, I do think it's understandable. Now, let me begin with a quick overview. When Mr. Bush came in, he was resolved not to be Bill Clinton. Everything that Bill Clinton wanted to do and held tight to, Mr. Bush put at arm's length. He was going to show that he was not Clinton. He was going to restore dignity to the White House, and I won't go into details on his reasons for that. However, he also noted that Bill Clinton tried very hard and used very scarce presidential time to try to bring about a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, as well as Israel and Syria, and failed. And when Mr. Bush came in, remember, he had limited political capital. He lost the popular vote. He squeaked by with perhaps a somewhat questionable decision in Florida on hanging Chads, and he had other issues that he was going to spend his scarce political capital on. One of them was trying to push to have the United States acquire an anti-ballistic missile, an ABM capability, and the other thing were major tax cuts. So he didn't want to get involved in what looked to be a losing proposition. The philosophy of the early Bush administration was, we're here to assist, not insist. The parties themselves have to reach a decision and we'll help them do it. But we're not going to push it. We have other things to do. That was the goal. Now, one may raise questions as to why Mr. Arafat, who I've met on several different occasions, did not accept either the deal at Camp David II or the even better Clinton proposal at the end of December 2000. It could well be that Mr. Arafat felt that given Bush's father and the clashes he'd had with the Israelis over settlements and other things, son would be like father and he would get a better deal from Bush than he did from Clinton. If this was indeed his expectation, he was badly misinformed, because Bush is perhaps the most pro-Israeli president in American history. He and Sharon got off very well together when they first met in 1998. You may not realize it, but when Mr. Bush was the governor of Texas, he went to Israel and was taken on a helicopter ride by Mr. Sharon, showing him the narrow borders of the state of Israel. And he's rumored to have said, you know, the road from my ranch in the desert of Texas to the main road is longer than the border that Israel has between the water and the Palestinian territories. And of course, Mr. Bush has a ranch in the middle of nowhere in the Texas desert, and so does Mr. Sharon have a ranch in the middle of nowhere in the Negev desert. So the two men hit it off. So when Mr. Sharon comes to Washington in March of 2001, it's a very successful visit. Remember, at that time, Bush was pushing very hard for an ABM deal, and Sharon was enthusiastically supporting it, because Israel also has a need for an ABM against Syria and increasingly Iran. And as you may know, that Israel and the United States for many years have cooperated together on the Arrow anti-missile missile. Well, when Sharon came back to Israel, Arafat was faced with a decision. It's very clear that Bush and Sharon are getting on. The Intifada is not going very well. So what do? Given the disparity of forces between the two sides, Israel very strong, the Palestinians very weak, the only solution for Arafat is to try to bring other players into the game: the Arab world, the European Union, and the United States. And the way to do that is to try to get the Israelis to overreact. So no sooner had Sharon gotten back from his visit to the United States than the Palestinians escalated the Intifada by firing missiles from Gaza into Israel proper. The Israelis responded by invading northern Gaza, at that time a Palestinian area, and immediately the State Department complained, and the Israelis pulled back. But here we have to come to another quirk or peculiarity of the Bush administration, which I think in the last few weeks has become absolutely clear to just about everybody. This administration is the most divided in American history. You have the State Department under Mr. Powell, usually on one side of the debate, the Vice President, Mr. Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Rumsfeld, on the other side, usually, but not always, supported by the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. And when you had criticism from the State Department, it was not always echoed by the White House. It took the Israelis a little while to figure out how to handle this. But most recently, you may remember in the fence episode, when the Israelis decided where to put the fence to safeguard against Palestinian suicide attacks, Mr. Powell was increasingly critical of the Israelis. And then in Haaretz, which is a left-leaning Israeli newspaper, there was an article saying, Israeli officials can't understand what's going on. After all, they cleared the route of the fence with the White House. What's wrong? Is Mr. Powell simply not informed as to what's going on? But you could say this is the divisions within the administration have also enabled the various players to play a bit more than they otherwise would. In any case, the Mitchell report came out in May. This was a major attempt after the Al-Aqsa Intifada broke out to try to figure out a way to solve the problem. And one of the things it called for was a ceasefire. Sharon agreed, Arafat initially did not. Then, however, came the suicide bombing at the Dolphinarium, a sort of disco on the waterfront in Tel Aviv, and the EU, which Arafat really wanted to get behind him, happened to have its representative, Joschka Fischer, the foreign minister of Germany, on the spot. He literally grabbed Arafat and said, you better agree to the ceasefire or you're going to lose EU support. So Arafat belatedly agreed to it, but Hamas rejected it, and even the Tanzim, or Mr. Arafat's own fighting force, disagreed, and it looked like the ceasefire was about to unravel. President Bush, now first initiative, sent George Tenet, the CIA chief, over to tighten it up. And it began to unravel again. Then he sent over Mr. Powell. We're now in June of 2001. Again, it started to unravel. And finally, at the end of June, Bush said, I knew I shouldn't have gotten involved in this. I've tried. I've sent Tenet. I've sent Powell. It's not working. Let the Europeans do it. So the Europeans tried during the summer without a lot of success. You had suicide bombings in the pizzeria in Jerusalem. The Israelis retaliated by taking over Orient House, which is a Palestinian center in East Jerusalem, and the situation got worse. As the suicide bombings picked up, Sharon decided on a new strategy, which was selective assassination, which basically is, if you think that terrorist is about to launch an attack or being trained by that boss to launch an attack, you take him out first. Again, State Department was very critical, U.S. State Department, of what Mr. Sharon was doing. But then Vice President Cheney gets up and said, well, you know, if Sharon really knows that this guy's about to launch an attack, then they're justified in striking first. So again, divided administration. Then comes 9/11. Now, 9/11 is a pivotal point. And if you've had a chance to read what Dahlan, the interior minister in the previous Palestinian Authority government under Abu Mazen, said, that the Palestinians never learned the lesson of 9/11, because the fight against terrorism became the main issue for the Bush administration. Now, initially, there was a little bit of awkwardness, fearing when the U.S. was about to go into Afghanistan after 9/11, the Muslim world might all rise up against the United States. The U.S. heavily pressured the Israelis to start talking to Arafat, even as violence continued. And of course, Sharon, you may remember what he said. He said, this is not Czechoslovakia in 1938. This is not Munich. We're not going to do it. But that spat was quickly changed. Now, by November, the balance of forces in the U.S. government had switched. Powell was trying to run a diplomatic war in Afghanistan. Rumsfeld, as you may recall, was for carpet bombing and a much tougher policy. Well, turned out that Rumsfeld won. The U.S. also won very rapidly. So as a triumphant Bush who comes to the UN in November and says, we want to have a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Two states living together in peace, but no terrorism. And Bush made it very clear. There is no such thing as a good terrorist. These were his words. And he didn't meet Arafat at the UN. In those days, Arafat could still travel. Why? Condoleezza Rice said, anybody who hugs Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad is not going to be met by the President of the United States. So Mr. Bush lays out the parameters of a settlement. Two-state solution sounds good. How do you implement it? Colin Powell is given the job. He gives a major lecture at the University of Louisville on the 19th of November, 2001, in which he spells out in detail two-state solution, no terrorism, Israeli stops settlement building, United States helps get the new Palestinian state on its feet economically and will help get the rest of the world to help. And he says, let's get a ceasefire first, let's get this process going. And he's going to send General Zinni, the former head of the Central Command, which is the American CENTCOM, American military force in the Middle East, to get it going. Good choice. President Bush, this is now initiative number 2. President Bush sticks his neck out. Some people don't realize this. He sent letters to Mubarak of Egypt, King Mohammed VI, the new young king of Morocco, President Ben Ali of Tunisia, King Abdullah II of Jordan, and Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, appealing to them directly to get Arafat to stop the terrorism so we can move the peace process forward. Zinni comes, and what happens? He's met by one terrorist attack after another, after another, after another. And his mission is destroyed. I talked to Zinni when he came back. He said, yeah, the terrorism made it impossible for me to continue. At that point, the Israelis decided to, quote, isolate Arafat, who belatedly on the 16th of December 2001 called for a ceasefire. Now, the next episode is the Karine A episode. Now, some of you may remember this. This is an armed ship sent by the conservative faction. You know, in Iran, there are two factions, the more liberal under Khatami and the conservatives under Khamenei, who have control of the Islamic Guard. This is a very conservative faction that apparently sent the weapons like Katyusha rockets, which are medium-range rockets, and C4, which is an explosive about yay size, a couple of which you can bring down a building this size if they're placed properly. These are not defensive weapons. They were intercepted by the Israelis. A number of the sailors on board were Palestinian. The Israelis provided proof to the Bush administration they're trying to smuggle arms in to exacerbate the Intifada. The administration turns to Arafat and asks Arafat, what's going on? And Arafat says, I know nothing about this. Now, you remember, some of you, I guess, are my age, you remember Hogan's Heroes? You know, you had this guy Schultz, who was the German sergeant who would go around when things happened saying, I know nothing. Well, that, if you read Crumb's book or others' books about the Bush administration, that apparently, and Woodward also, this was a turning point on relations between the Bush administration and Arafat. Okay, that's fine for the U.S. to say we're not going to get involved again. But the Middle East kept heating up. And now, by February, March, the U.S. has a new agenda, remember. And the new agenda is preparing diplomatically and militarily for a war against Iraq. And it's fascinating, again, a little bit of incoherence in the administration. On February 28th, you can look it up, New York Times interview, Powell says, he's asked, well, why don't you do something about the Middle East? The situation is getting worse. Suicide bombings, Israeli retaliations, do something, do something, do something. So Powell sits there in the interview. It was a remarkable interview. In fact, remember you read that interview in class way back when. It's one of my good students there. And he said, well, you know, being active usually means bringing pressure against the Israelis. And that's something we're simply not going to do until the Palestinians stop their terrorism. But a day later, Bush decides he's got to do something. Mr. Cheney's in the Middle East trying to build up support for the war against Iraq. The Arabs are unanimous in telling him, the Arab allies of the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, are saying, look, the road to Baghdad leads through Jerusalem. You want to get our support, you've got to solve the Arab-Israeli thing first. So Mr. Zinni is sent back to the Middle East. Heavy pressure again brought on the Israelis, and on Sharon to drop his demand for 7 days of quiet. before negotiations start. So reluctantly, Sharon does it. What happens? Zinni comes back, and the Saudis, who get a very bad press in this country, are very helpful at this point. They announce they're going to give a plan at the Arab summit in Beirut at the end of March, calling for a two-state solution and a fair settlement of the refugee problem, which is, of course, one of the big problems in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it looks like you're building up for another major effort. Zinni's there, and he's trying, and what happens? The Israelis sit down to a Passover Seder, and 30 of them are killed in Netanya by a suicide bombing, followed by one in Haifa, Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv. This time, Sharon's, whose polls have gone through the floor now, has had it. He attacks the Muqata, Arafat's fortress there in Ramallah, and he invades the West Bank. At this point, Bush is in a quandary. There are Arab demonstrations against what the Israelis are doing. Now, on the one hand, he appreciates what the Israelis are doing because they are fighting the same kind of terrorism the U.S. is facing. On the other hand, however, he needs Arab support for the war against Iraq. So what does he do? As most politicians, he cuts it in half. He issues a speech on the 4th of April, 2002, in which he says, Arafat's got to stop this terrorism or there's not going to be any movement forward in the peace process. And by the way, Israelis, you better pull out of the West Bank because that's not helpful either. And I'm sending Mr. Powell back to the Middle East to try to bring about a ceasefire. And 2 days later, he tells the Israelis to pull out without delay. Well, this sets off a firestorm of protest here in the United States. A number of groups. First of all, the neoconservatives, who are the brains of this administration, if you want to use that term, and they say, Mr. Bush, you are not consistent. The Israelis have just been hit by a series of terrorist attacks. They're responding. This is exactly what we did in Afghanistan. How can you criticize the Israelis? Then the evangelical Christians, who are part of his core domestic group. These are the people who've got to get out the vote for him in 2004. They're key members of his base core constituency. And they attack him as they are more Zionist than most Jews are in terms of supporting Israel. Finally, the American Jewish community was up in arms. Now, up until this time, the American Jewish community is split into three parts. There are the doves of peace now are pushing the Israelis into concessions and getting out of the settlements. Then the center, basically, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, pretty well supporting whoever the Israeli prime minister is in power. And then the right-wing ZOA, Zionist Organization of America, which is bitterly anti-Arafat, bitter any possibility of a deal. Well, what you had after these terrorist attacks was a coalescence of the center and right in the American Jewish community, and a real rightward turn in the American Jewish community. And there was a major demonstration in Washington on the 15th of April, 2002, in where you had not only Jewish speakers, but congressmen, evangelical Christians, and the congressmen, both houses of Congress, were very strong supporting Israel. And Mr. Bush began to backpedal. By the end of April, he was calling on Arafat to stamp out terrorism. The Israelis made yet another concession. Sharon pulled back in May from the West Bank. Then Mrs. Arafat, unfortunately, put her foot in her mouth, because in May, she lives in Paris with their child, and said, you know, if I had a son, the greatest thing I could wish for was for him to be a suicide bomber. That did not go over well with the Bush administration, to put it mildly. Then another series of terrorist attacks occur the end of May and in June, and the Israelis are back in the West Bank, totally now except for Jericho. And this time the president does not criticize them, does not criticize them. Indeed, he gives a speech, a now famous speech, on the 24th of June of 2002, and he says, the only hope for a settlement is for a change in leadership among the Palestinians. There's got to be an empowered Palestinian prime minister who can crack down on the terrorists. Now, while this is all going on, the European allies in the United States and the EU, plus the UN, plus the Russians, are sort of upset. So they managed to get together with the U.S. and start working on what's called a quartet and a roadmap for peace in the Middle East. But having been part of some of the preliminary talks on this roadmap myself in Germany, it's very clear the only reason the U.S. is interested in the quartet, quite honestly, as I tried, I'm not sure with how much success, to point out to the Europeans, was that, look, the U.S. has now tried 2001 in the spring, in June, November 2001, now again, April 2002, without success. Okay, Europeans, try again. Let's see if the quartet can do anything. But by now, the U.S. is really gearing up for the war against Iraq. The president goes to the UN, remember, in September, gives his speech. And for the next 3 or 4 months, everybody's preoccupied with Iraq. The roadmap sits on the side table. Nothing happens. And then comes the great American victory, initial victory at least, in Iraq. Now, an empowered President Bush says, now we're going to do what I wanted to do with the UN in November of 2001. Let's move ahead with a two-state solution. Okay? They published the roadmap. Now, the roadmap was not entirely to either the Israelis' happiness or a lot of the congressmen's happiness. It's only called for the Palestinians to begin to crack down on terrorism, as well as for the Israelis to pull back settlements, but it was a start at least. And it was a start. It was certainly better than nothing. It's a three-stage solution leading to two Palestinian state alongside of Israel by 2005. And it's going to be reached in phases. Okay. What happens? Mr. Bush, again, investing presidential prestige. I have to emphasize this. No matter how popular the president is, he's only got a certain amount of political capital. So he meets a group of Arab allies of the United States in the Middle East to get them behind the roadmap. A lot of photo ops, okay, we're behind it. Then he meets the new Palestinian prime minister. At the height of his power after the victory in Iraq, the Palestinians have been cowed into essentially doing what Mr. Bush wanted them to do, which is to appoint a prime minister, not yet an empowered one. This is Abu Mazen. And Abu Mazen and Sharon meet with Mr. Bush. There's a lot of photo ops, and it looks like things are moving forward. Abu Mazen manages to negotiate a hudna, or a ceasefire of sorts, with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but not with the other groups. And he says he's going to stop incitement, and he begins to paint over anti-Israeli graffiti in Gaza. That's one of his main accomplishments during this period. For his part, Mr. Sharon pulls out of northern Gaza and pulls out of Bethlehem, pulls Israeli forces out, releases some prisoners, although it's interesting, that was not a requirement of the roadmap, but it was done to bolster Abu Mazen, but there were not enough prisoners released that really would have supported Abu Mazen, or so he claimed, but be that as it may, there were some tentative movements toward peace. And guess what happened for the fourth time? A series of terrorist attacks, finally one on August 19th of this year, which brought the roadmap and the hudna and the chances of any movement toward an Arab-Israeli peace, at least Israeli-Palestinian peace, to an end. Okay, now, where lies the problem? Okay. What Bush said on the 24th of June and what he pushed for in the roadmap was very simple. It was an empowered Palestinian prime minister, not Arafat, who would have control of the security forces and use them to crack down and root out the terrorist groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. Abu Mazen tried to convince the State Department, well, first of all, he didn't have control over all the forces. Arafat had still control over 5, he only had control over 2. And he tried to get more control and was unsuccessful. Then he tried to convince Powell and the State Department, look, I've negotiated a ceasefire with these terrorists, they didn't call them terrorist organizations, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Fine, let's do this, this will be a step to peace. And the State Department almost seemed to buy it when the August 19th suicide bombing took place in Jerusalem, killing a lot of kids as well as parents. These happened to be religious Jews, and that was the end. Abu Mazen fell. He's now been replaced by Abu Allah, who may also fall because the same problem. He doesn't have control over the security forces, which Arafat continues to control. Now, where does this leave the peace process, and where does this leave Mr. Bush? I think there are only a few options available. One option is to do what he did in September, October 2001 and tried to do in early April 2002, which is, pressure the Israelis into major concessions. This, he hopes, will win over the Arab world and the EU, and in so doing, this might help the U.S. in an increasingly precarious position in Iraq, because the prestige of Mr. Bush, which was so high in April, has taken a nosedive, although it's recently recovered a little bit in the polls. If he tries that approach, he's likely to run into exactly the same problems he ran into last time. Evangelical Christians, American Congressman, House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. Some of you may have read the article about him in today's Washington Post. If you haven't, it's worth reading. Staunch supporter of Israel, obviously the American Jewish community, and if it's a close election, Bush is going to need the active efforts of the evangelical Christians and the Jews located in key electoral states to win, especially if he's facing Clark. So that option might not work. The other option, and I'm afraid the option that he's taking is, well, I've now tried 4 times. June of 2001, November of 2001, April of 2002, and again in April, May, June, July of 2003, using presidential prestige to bring about an agreement. Each time it's been sabotaged by terrorism. It's not worth my political capital to do this anymore. I'm going to wait it out. Maybe Arafat will die one way or another. Maybe there'll be a new Israeli leadership. I've got to wait for a better situation. So to come back to Dr. Byrd's question right at the beginning, is there a chance for peace? Right now, I'm afraid to say no. I don't see any major movement happening until 2 things occur. One, Arafat, who has no credibility with the Israelis at all, is removed one way or another from office. Or 2, after the presidential election, if Mr. Bush or another president wins and decides to try another initiative. And let me just end on sort of a personal note. Some of you have seen the Balin Yasser Abu agreement called the Geneva Agreement, which has been negotiated between the doves of labor and some of the key Palestinians. When I met with Mr. Arafat in February of 1989, right after he had come out with the 2-state solution, renouncing terrorism, by the way, as part of that, and coming out with the 2-state solution, I told him, most Israelis don't believe you. All you have done is won over the left wing of labor and parties to its left by your statement. That's only 25% of the population. You have to win over the right wing of labor, then including Rabin, and at least the centrists of Likud. Well, right now where Mr. Arafat is, he not only doesn't have the Likud or the right wing of labor, he doesn't have very much of the left wing of labor except for the extreme left. And I really don't think there's going to be a settlement until there is new leadership. And on that, perhaps not too positive note, let me stop and ask for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
My question to you is this. It has to do with the war of Iraq. I heard President Bush speak about the reason we went into Iraq and devastated that country, and it had to do with weapons of mass destruction. He was most specific about what they had and what they were going to do. Apparently, nothing materialized. I would like to know how much of that information, which turned out apparently to be false, was supplied by the Israeli intelligence, perhaps the Mossad, and done deliberately to involve us in a situation that I consider devastating. Thank you.
It's not really foreign interests taking over the United States. Tom DeLay would sort of be shocked if he said foreign interests, and I think so would the Christian Coalition, and so would the vast majority of American Jews. Now, you may have heard Mr. Monte here from Malaysia speaking today at the Islamic conference when he said Jews are controlling the world. But if you don't buy that theory and you buy the fact that, A, the point I tried to make, is the Americans suffered a major terrorist attack in 9/11. The Israelis have been suffering a series of major terrorist attacks. That does tend to bring the two sides together. And I also said that Dahlan, the interior minister, said the big mistake of the Palestinians was not to recognize that factor. Well, that's the first point. Now, while this lecture is not about Iraq, if I may respond to the question, Frank?
Yes,
Okay.
and I think especially the Mossad.
Yeah,
part of it.
the evidence on the arms came from Mr. Chalabi. Mr. Chalabi is a Shia Iraqi exile, the favorite of a number of people in the Defense Department, and last I looked, he was not a Mossad agent. The dilemma, again, remember, so far we've had, but it's an important question, I want to address it. David Kay, who actually went to graduate school with at Columbia, so I know David, who's doing the inspection, is a very straight guy. He's issued an interim report, which both sides have seized on. Those on the left have tended to argue, wow, they didn't find the smoking gun. Those on the right say, well, wait a minute. Saddam Hussein was developing long-range missiles, which were not permitted under the sanctions regime, and biological weapons that were not permitted under these. And if he could have linked them together, he could have launched these missiles. Was it an imminent threat? How imminent was it? I think we have to wait on that until Dave Kay gives his final report. But again, it was not Mossad who supplied most of the intelligence, it was Chalabi.
It appears, can you hear me now? Okay.
I'll repeat the question. Okay.
That the radical element among the Palestinians is in control, the thugs, the killers, and the people who obviously don't want a peace, at least as it's been outlined. Is there, if these people could somehow be controlled, is there enough of a middle left among the Palestinians to negotiate at some future date some kind of a settlement?
Okay, is there enough of a middle left among the Palestinians? The answer is yes, but. And let me try to explain what I mean by yes, but. Arafat, to my view, is still has control. He has 30,000 troops under arms. If he wanted to crack down on the terrorists, he could. By terrorists, let me be very clear what I mean in definition. Terrorist is somebody who deliberately kills civilians for political reasons. That's the accepted definition of terrorism. Okay, what could he do? If he wanted to, he could crack down. Did you notice how quickly he arrested those people this morning who had attacked the Americans in Gaza? Amazing how quickly that was done while the terrorists who carried out the other attacks were not taken in. Anyway, assuming these were the people who really did it, but he wanted to show he could do it. Okay. What is Arafat's attitude toward terrorism? I don't want to compare Arafat and Ronald Reagan, except in one point. Remember, former President Reagan talked about the big Republican tent, where he finessed the issue of homosexuals in the Republican Party. Well, Arafat believes in the giant Palestinian tent, with all the elements, including the terrorist elements. He wants to hold them together for as long as possible before he gets his state. Now, the problem is that's, especially after 9/11, I go back to Dahlan's statement, that's a self-defeating strategy because you'll never win over the Israelis with that. But he could do it. Now, I happen to personally be in favor of this Geneva Agreement by Yossi Beilin and Yasser Abrabu. I know both people. Yasser Abrabu I had very long talks with when I was in Tunis in 1989. Of all the top tier of Palestinian leadership, he understands the Israelis better and the Israeli political situation better than anybody else. I had further talks with him in the conference with the Europeans in Germany in 2002. I mean, he is a serious individual, and there are people like that who you can deal with. Unfortunately, until Arafat is eliminated, there's no chance for these people to come forward. That's the blunt reality.
The current so-called intifada,
Intifada.
period of heightened terrorist activity seems to have dated from about 3 years ago when Mr. Sharon and his militia entered the several Arab holy sites in Jerusalem. And then there was the subsequent election of the Likud party candidate, Sharon. The Likud party has as its probably single main platform that there will never be an Arab state east of the Jordan River. If that's so, if you seem to be placing a lot of emphasis on the end of terrorist activity before any movement could be made, even if all of the Arab terrorist activity ended, do you see the Likud party, or even the majority of the Israeli population, willing to allow an Arab state east of the Jordan? Thank
Okay,
you.
very good question. First of all, the word is intifada. It's a second Palestinian uprising. The first one started in December, just for the record, December of 1987, and continued more or less to the Oslo Agreement of September of 1993. This one started in the end of September of 2000 and has continued to the present. Now, what set it off? I would draw your attention to the Mitchell report. One of its strengths is it has two different narratives. The Israeli narrative as to what set it off, and the Palestinian narrative as to what set it off. And just to be very succinct here, the Palestinians claim it was Sharon and not his militia, but actually a number of Israeli police going up to the Temple Mount, which did it. And the Palestinians had to react because, after all, this was their holy land. The Israeli narrative is rather different. The Israeli narrative goes something like this. Israel withdrew under fire from Lebanon in May of 2000. No agreement with Lebanon, no agreement to protect it. Barak showed his weakness by trying to save a few Israeli lives of soldiers by pulling back. The Palestinians learned from this that a sufficient military pressure can get the Israelis to pull back. They were waiting for the incident to happen, and once they did, they started the violence, hoping to replicate or repeat exactly what Hezbollah did to Israel in southern Lebanon. So that's sort of the Israeli narrative. Now, you may choose what you wish. The Mitchell report chooses not to go either one, but to do it. When the Likud voted for the roadmap, which it did fairly decisively, okay, it acknowledged a two-state solution, okay? Sharon had done it before. He said there has to be a Palestinian state. When the Likud cabinet, Likud is running the country, voted after the roadmap came out in favor of it, that was their endorsement of the two-state solution. Now, where does the problem lie, and how much territory are the Palestinians going to get? Arafat had a chance to get 98% of it in the Clinton deal of December of 2000. He turned it down. Bad mistake in my view. Okay, he's going to get less under Sharon. But if you carefully look at which way the fence, the Israeli security fence, is being drawn, which, even if it includes Ariel, which is sort of inside the West Bank, and places like Beitar Eilit and a few places like that, the Palestinians are still going to wind up with 92% of the West Bank and all of Gaza ultimately in a state. And watch which way the security fence is finally, and that may be the border. So, yes, to make a long story short, Likud has come out in favor, maybe some people reluctantly, for a two-state solution. The question is now over how much territory and what the refugee situation was going to be like. The Yossi Beil and Yasser Abrabu situation was about 98 or 99%, very similar to the Clinton plan.
Do you believe that the two-state solution has a chance at peace with Arafat in the leadership?
No. Bluntly, so long as he is the leader. And why? Because I personally don't like Arafat, somebody I've met with on a number of occasions. I leave, in this case, as an analyst, personal feelings aside. What's the problem? He has absolutely zero credibility with the Israeli electorate, okay? Any agreement at this stage that he would put forth would be overwhelmingly repudiated by the Israeli public. And that's why it has no chance, let alone because he is seen as somebody who's aided and abetted terrorists, and on and on and on. So it's simply not going to work.
As a liberal Democrat, what do you make of Howard Dean's statement that he'd like to see a more even-handed policy, U.S. policy on the Middle East? And part two, which among the current crop of Democratic contenders for the throne next year do you think might have the best chance of coming up with a real solution to this problem?
Well, Dean has gone back and forth on that, like Wesley Clark has gone back and forth on should you go into Iraq. He took the statement, saw the flack, and backed down on. Of course, Lieberman and others and Kerry really socked it to him, and he realized he better come back a little bit. As my candidate, and I say this not because I used to teach at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Put that aside, but I do believe in truth in advertising. I've got to tell you where my own background is. I think Wesley Clark did a masterful job in Kosovo. He understands the use of force a lot better than the Clinton administration did, quite honestly. I think he would have the best chance to win. Why? Because Mr. Bush is going to wrap himself around the flag of security and protecting the country from another 9/11. And none of the other Democratic candidates, except maybe Kerry and Lieberman, but not strong enough, can do that. Wesley Clark, however, who himself has been a military commander while Bush never served in the military, certainly can stand up to him on security issues. And if he's balanced on security issues and the economy continues to go down, then Clark, I think, has the best chance to win. My worry about Mr. Dean is that he reminds me just a little too much of, if not Dukakis, then McGovern. And I think he would be very vulnerable to Bush. I think Bush is rooting for Dean to win, quite honestly.
The last 10 administrations, frankly, in this country have tried to have peace in the Middle East, and they've had very little success. I have a horrible feeling that 10 administrations from now, we'll still be talking about the same issue. Am I unduly pessimistic on the issue? You imply that maybe after Arafat's gone, there could be peace in the Middle East. What is your long-range outlook?
All right, my long-range outlook is this. There is a fairly vibrant Palestinian civil society, even with Arafat, which he has basically bottled up, okay? When he leaves, and a civil society, as you know, is very necessary for democracy, I think there's a chance. Now, administrations have made progress. Jimmy Carter helped bring about the Israeli-Egyptian agreement. Okay, Mr. Clinton helped bring about, although the parties themselves negotiated it, he was a cheerleader for the Israeli-Jordanian agreement. He himself helped get the agreement on Hebron, and the Israeli then withdrawal from Hebron. The Y agreement, he tried very hard. I think, let me use the words of Mr. Powell, okay? I think Colin Powell is certainly a man of great integrity with whom I have the greatest personal respect. Powell said after his first visit to the Middle East, which is in February of 2001, this is before the Intifada was going on, but before things really heated up too badly. He said, you know, I've traveled around the Middle East. I see King Abdullah II, he's thinking like a modern person. Mubarak is thinking like a modern person. The Israelis are thinking like modern people, but Arafat is thinking in the past. This is what he said. You can look it up. And I think that's the problem. I think there is certainly potential for movement. Both Abu Mazen and Abu Allah to get, these two could negotiate a peace deal with the Israelis. They really could. Yasser Abu in this latest plan, for me at least, it makes a lot of sense. The Israeli public has to be won over to it. So in that way, I'm optimistic in a post-Arafat Palestinian scenario. Now, from the Israeli side, the dilemma as I see it, and it has to be addressed frankly, is this. When the Intifada erupted, okay, those people on the right of Israel who had been pushing settlements all the time said, Now we have our chance to really proliferate settlements. The Palestinians are showing they don't want any peace. Let's us build more and more and more settlements. So that has to be stopped also. And a lot of them rolled back, no question about that. But as I said, if you look at where most of the settlements are, I mean, 80% of the Israeli population can be included within this wall with relatively few Palestinians, giving 92% of the land in the West Bank back to the Palestinians. That's doable. But you're not going to get it until Arafat goes. That's the reality. I am optimistic, relatively optimistic after that, yeah.
Why is it that the rest of the Arab countries do not appear to be helping calm the situation?
Well, it depends on which Arab country. The Saudis, as I said, have been pretty well maligned before, but they've tried. The Saudi plan that they introduced to first by way of Tom Freedman, the New York Times, in February of 2002, and then actually brought to the Beirut summit in March of 2002, talked about, you know, a Palestinian state and Israel living next to each other or more or less on the 67 borders and a fair solution to the refugee problem. I think that was a major step forward. The Crown Prince Abdullah also said that, you know, this would enable the Arabs to recognize the state of Israel if this ever happened, which was a major step forward. King Abdullah II of Jordan has been leaning over backwards to try to push the peace process in the face of some fairly stiff Islamist opposition in his own country. Mubarak has not been as helpful as he might have been. Let me just put it this way. And those are the only key players. Now, King Mohammed VI of Morocco has also been trying in recent months to move the peace process forward. So there have been moves on the side of the Arabs, but I'm one of those who strongly believes that all the press from the Arabs outside isn't going to do anything until the Palestinians themselves decide one way or another. So they are independent players.
Would you comment on an observation made a few weeks ago by Tom Freedman, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, I don't know, but he talked about it would inure to the advantage of the Palestinians to forget about the two-state solution and instead opt for a one-state solution. Let Israel absorb everything, the West Bank, Gaza, everything, because the demographics are such that with probably as shortly as 10 years, the Arabs will so far outnumber the Jews that, in fact, you could have an Arab government governing Israel.
Okay, I looked at those. Actually, there was a meeting in Washington yesterday where we played with those projections, and it's by the year 2010, there'll be more or less even, counting the Arabs currently under Israeli occupation plus the Israeli Arabs, you know, vis-a-vis the Israeli Jews, and more or less even with a few more Israelis, Jews. By 2020, the balance turns, so there are about 53% Arabs and 47% Jews in this whole territory, counting again the Israeli Arabs. Now, demographics are very dangerous. You know, most demographers and their predictions have turned out to be wrong, but let's assume this is correct. This is one of the unsung achievements of building the security fence. Because when you build the security fence, you have created ipso facto a two-state solution vis-a-vis the security fence, but you have to do it right. What I mean by doing it right is, okay, there are two states and you don't enter one to the other. Therefore, you don't have marriages between West Bank Arabs and Israeli Arabs, which are going on now. You cut this off so there is a predominantly Jewish state with an Israeli Arab minority and an almost totally Palestinian Arab state. Two states separated by a fence who hopefully in another generation can learn to live together. That's bluntly it. And that will solve the demographic problem, as well as the security problem to a large extent.
You've commented about what happens after Arafat, or at least some things may happen differently after Arafat. Could you comment on the effect of what might happen on the way in which Arafat disappears, whether it's retiring to Paris or being shot, or can you give us some scenarios and what the results might be?
Okay. Optimally, in terms of the peace process, which I think you're really referring to. If Arafat were to suffer a stroke or a heart attack or be removed by the Palestinians themselves in a way they felt was legitimate, and a new Palestinian government were to emerge, which could then negotiate with the Israelis, that would be optimum. Okay. If the Israelis take Arafat out, okay, then there'll be a period of chaos while the Palestinians try to sort everything out, which would probably give rise to more strength for Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. Now, even if that were to happen in the long run, say Hamas wins an election, okay, not impossible, then they're faced with a choice. If they carry on their pledge to destroy Israel, then everybody in the world would be on Israel's side. Okay, go destroy them first. But Hamas has a second goal, which is to Islamize the Palestinian people. And since the Palestinian people now are primarily secular, you know, and there's a genuine second election, they may lose. And you may get then a secular group willing to make peace with Israel. So ideally, it's better if the Palestinians do it themselves, because you'll save a lot of chaos that way.
You may have anticipated my question just a second ago. You said you were optimistic about what might happen in the long run with the Palestinians after Arafat's off the scene. But my question is, isn't it equally possible that the radicals within the Palestinians, principally Hamas and some of the other groups, would take over either through democratic means or through violent means, or even if they took over democratically, there might never be a second election? And wouldn't that be disastrous?
Well, one man, one vote, one time, as they say, if no second election. Well, you know, that is obviously a risk, but if you don't mind me just very quickly repeating what I said before, so they take over, play it out. They're going to mobilize the entire Palestinian population to go confront Israel, then they're asking to be simply destroyed. I mean, the reality of it, although people don't like to talk about it, but I think we have to put it on the table, the Israelis have used maybe 15% of their total force that they could use against the Palestinians up until now. There's far more force than they have, which they've not employed. And should Hamas win an election and pledge, now we're going to destroy Israel, then you'll really see force. But that's why I think the Hamas these are no dummies. They would say, well, let's go to goal 2 first, try to Islamize the Palestinian people. And then if it's one vote, one time, then maybe they will be thrown out by the Palestinians themselves. It all depends on the kind of constitution they write. Thank you.
Let me very directly thank him for sharing the evening with us so generously. Thanks.